Let's talk about another of the Deontic paradoxes, the paradoxes of Deontic logic. That's the logic of obligation and permission. This one is a little more complicated than others I've talked about. It was developed by Roderick Chisholm. There are two things that go by the name Chisholm's paradox. One of them is this one, also known as the contrary to duty paradox, and the other is a paradox of modal logic, where people essentially, across various possible worlds, switch all of their properties gradually and become carbon copies of the other. But for now, I just want to focus on the Deontic paradox, the contrary to duty paradox. It's something that emerges when somebody does something contrary to duty. And if you think seriously about the robber and victim paradoxes, for example, or the gentle murder paradox, you might realize that that's an aspect of the paradoxical nature of those things. That is to say, somebody does something they shouldn't do. They commit a robbery, or they suffer a robbery, or they commit a murder, gently or not. They're doing something they shouldn't do. They're doing something contrary to duty. And Chisholm identifies an aspect of that, an aspect that's independent of that principle we've talked about of closure under logical consequence. So what exactly is the paradox that involves acting in a way that's contrary to duty, the Chisholm paradox? Here's a classic case of this. Anne ought to visit her grandmother. It ought to be the case that if Anne visits her grandmother, she calls her first to say she's coming. If Anne doesn't visit her grandmother, she should not call her first to say she's coming. And, in fact, Anne does not visit her grandmother. It ought to be the case that if she visits, she calls first, but if she doesn't visit, she shouldn't call first. So, intuitively speaking, should she call her grandmother? Well, she ought to go, but she doesn't go. And so, intuitively, we say, well, then, yeah, she shouldn't call. It would be terrible to say, oh, I ought to go, I guess I ought to call her, so call her, and then poor grandma's waiting for her and she never shows up. So if she doesn't go, she shouldn't call. But now we have a paradox. At first glance, you might say, why? That's kind of obvious, right? And not so much. Let's take a look at those first two premises. Anne ought to visit her grandmother. And it ought to be the case that if Anne visits her grandmother, she calls her first to say she's coming. Well, it looks as if, then, she ought to call, right? The paradox plays on the distinction between it ought to be the case that if she visits, she calls, and if she visits, she ought to call. And so it's a question of the scope of that deontic operator. Is it's obligatory that if she goes, she calls, or is it if she goes, it's obligatory that she calls? So let's be careful. It ought to be the case that if she visits, she calls. Well, she ought to visit. It ought to be the case that if she visits, she calls. It looks like she ought to call. Why? Well, because she ought to go. And if she ought to go, she ought to call. And so it's natural to conclude that she ought to call her grandmother. Well, that's an instance of what Chisholm calls deontic detachment. That is to say, an application of modus ponens within the scope of a deontic operator like obligation. And it does seem kind of intuitive. She ought to go. Hey, and look, it ought to be true that if you go, you call first, so you ought to call. But on the other hand, look at the last two premises. If Anne doesn't visit, she shouldn't call. Anne doesn't visit. Well, straightforward modus ponens, so she shouldn't call. And so it looks like from the first two premises, we get the conclusion that Anne ought to call. From the last two, that she shouldn't call. Hence the paradox. Should Anne call or not? Now, intuitively, we say, well, no, okay, because she's not going. She should have gone, and so she should have called because she was going to go, but she didn't do that, so no. Now, one way of looking at this, then, is to say the first two premises together give us an instance of deontic detachment. It ought to be the case that P, and it ought to be the case that if P then Q, so it ought to be the case that Q. By itself, that seems plausible enough. Hey, you have an obligation to do this. And it ought to be the case that if you do that, you do this other thing. So you ought to be doing that other thing too. Entirely reasonable. But the modus ponens of the last two, which Chisholm calls factual detachment, also seems very plausible. Hey, P is true. If P is true, then it ought to be the case that Q is true. So it ought to be the case that Q is true. Anne's not going, and if she's not going, she shouldn't call, so she shouldn't call. Straightforward. And so both seem entirely plausible. Now, intuitively, we conclude she shouldn't call. What that seems to indicate is that factual detachment takes precedence over deontic detachment. Hey, you should have done that because you should have done this other thing, but you didn't. So now another obligation takes precedence. And what that tells us, yeah, we can put it in abstract terms, deontic detachment is less powerful than factual detachment. Factual detachment takes precedence. We go on the basis of the facts, not what the facts should have been. But more intuitively speaking, what it means is that if you act contrary to duty, you've now got a different set of obligations. And the obligations that you now have outweigh whatever obligations you had before. So it seems to follow that once you make a moral mistake, that changes the moral game in fundamental ways. It changes the nature of your obligations. It changes the nature of your permissions. Sometimes it adds new ones, like, hey, you ought to apologize for missing that appointment. But sometimes it just means other obligations go away. Hey, you should call because you should go, and you should call first. But you don't go, so you shouldn't call. And it's the failure to fulfill one obligation that means that obligation that followed from it goes away too, and now it gets replaced by a different kind of obligation. So I think in this case, there isn't a simple moral that tells us, there's something wrong with the logical principle, or we've got to rethink the logic of these inferences altogether. That may be true here too, but part of what it tells us is that when you fail to live up to one duty, then other duties that you had before may go away and new ones may be added. Things change. You have upset the tables, normatively speaking, and you are under a different set of obligations.